The year is 1907. The streets of the Shanghai settlement are streets the police don't enter alone. He is just 22 years old when he's stationed there, where gang controls what the law cannot reach. That is just how it was. Over 33 years, this man records more than 600 close quarters confrontations. Knives, bare hands, improvised weapons in the dark. He is stabbed, shot, beaten badly enough on at least one occasion that colleagues do not expect him to walk away. But he always does. And every fight he pays attention. Then, sometime in 1941, he puts all of it into a knife. So, how did it happen? This is a knife guy's story. His name is William Fairbairn. He arrives in Shanghai in 1907, already a Royal Marine, trained the way young soldiers of his generation are trained. Boxing, basic wrestling, pistol drill built for a parade ground. That training assumes an opponent who fights fair, in the light, one at a time, by rules both men understand. Shanghai does not offer any of that. The international settlement is a city inside a city. Britain, France, and America each administer their own zone under their own law, a legal patchwork stitched together out of 19th century treaties that nobody designed to work this way. Neither Chinese courts nor Chinese police can reach across those internal borders. What fills that gap does not stay empty for long. The Green Gang becomes one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Asia, running opium, gambling, and protection across the settlement, with the confidence of an institution that knows exactly where the law stops and it begins. There are streets the Shanghai Municipal Police does not patrol without numbers. Political killings of labor organizers, of rival faction men, of foreigners who cross the wrong business interest happen often enough that the newspapers give them a paragraph and move on. Fairbairn's first years on the force teach him, physically, that what he arrived knowing is not enough. Boxing assumes a standing opponent who intends to trade blows in a lit space. The Shanghai alley gives you a man with a knife who intends the whole thing to be over before anyone hears it. Wrestling assumes a single opponent and a clean surface. The street gives you several men, broken ground, and whatever happens to be within reach. A bottle, a length of pipe, a chair leg. Fairbairn is stabbed for the first time not long after he joins. He survives it, he does not forget why it happened, and he starts paying closer attention to exactly what worked and what didn't in the half second before the blade came out. By 1910, the Shanghai Municipal Police puts him in charge of training the rest of the force in hand-to-hand combat. It is the obvious institutional choice. The man surviving the worst of the city should be the one teaching the others how. What the assignment gives Fairbairn is a mandate to build something that works, tested against a standard no training hall back in England could offer. Shanghai grades the homework immediately and without mercy. If a technique fails on the street, someone ends up in a hospital or in the ground. There is no better laboratory for close combat anywhere in the world in 1910, and no crueler one. He builds the S&P Reserve Unit, by most historical accounts, the first organized police rapid response team anywhere, a group trained to move fast into exactly the kind of situation ordinary patrol officers were told to avoid. He builds and commands the riot squad as well, responsible for the settlement's crowd violence, which in a city this politically volatile is a near constant demand. Both units are trained on techniques Fairbairn is still developing in real time, refined after every deployment, based on what actually happened rather than what the manual predicted. The 1927 Shanghai Massacre, Chiang Kai-shek's violent purge of communist organizers, carried out with machine gun fire and mass arrests in streets, Fairbairn's men patrol happens around him. Political violence on a scale that dwarfs the ordinary criminal work of the settlement, he does not request a transfer. He does not leave the city. He keeps working, keeps commanding the riot squad through some of the worst civil violence Shanghai will see in the interwar period, and keeps building the file of what actually happens when trained men meet real chaos. The confrontations that make up his 600 are not uniform. Some are single opponents in a doorway. Some are 3 or 4 men who have decided together that tonight is the night. Some happen in full daylight in a market crowd, where a blade appears and disappears again before most of the people around him even register what has happened. Fairbairn starts to notice something the official reports never capture. The fights that go badly are almost never the ones where he is outmatched in skill. They are the ones where he hesitates even briefly while sorting through which technique to use. The fights that end quickly and cleanly are the ones where he moves before he has finished thinking. That observation made slowly and painfully across dozens of separate incidents, becomes the seed of everything he builds afterward. He also starts to notice what actually stops a man, not a solid punch to the jaw which looks decisive in a boxing ring and often does almost nothing to a man who is drunk, enraged, or simply committed to killing him. A strike to the eyes stops a man. A strike to the throat stops a man, immediately and completely, regardless of his size or his intent. Fairbairn is not interested in what wins a sporting contest. He is interested in what ends a fight in the next half second, because in Shanghai, the next half second is frequently the only one he is going to get. By the time he boards a ship out of Shanghai in 1940, his body carries the record of everything the city put him through. Scars from knife wounds run across his arms, his torso, even the palms of his hands, where a blade has been caught and turned aside more than once. There is at least one beating severe enough that his colleagues do not expect him to survive it. He does, and goes back to work. 600 documented close-quarters confrontations sit behind him, each one a different problem solved in real time with whatever tool the moment offered, against whatever the city decided to throw at him that night. He does not leave Shanghai with a theory of combat. He leaves with 33 years of direct evidence about what actually works when a man is trying to kill you. And there is no referee, no rules, and no second attempt if you get it wrong. He spends those same 33 years turning the evidence into a system. He travels to Japan and trains at the Kodokan, the founding institution of judo, established by Jigoro Kano just a few decades earlier, and becomes one of the first Westerners to earn a black belt there. He studies Okinawan karate on separate trips. He learns from Chinese martial artists inside the settlement itself, men whose own fighting traditions have been shaped by generations in exactly this environment. He does not collect these disciplines as credentials. He runs every technique he learns through a single brutal filter. Does this work in the dark, at arm's length, when you are already hurt, against a man who has no interest in following any rule you were taught? Most of what he studies fails that test. This is not a mark against judo or karate. Both are internally consistent systems within the conditions they were designed for: a mat, a partner, an agreed set of engagement. But a joint lock that depends on a cooperative opponent falls apart the moment the other man simply refuses to cooperate, which is the entire premise of a street fight. A striking sequence that depends on a clear head does not survive genuine fear, because fear strips away fine motor control faster than any of these systems account for. What survives Fairbairn's filter is smaller and uglier than any tradition he studied whole. Strikes to the throat, the eyes, the groin, the knees, targets that do not require precision to damage, movements large and blunt enough that a frightened man's hands can still execute them when his hands are shaking. He calls the resulting system Defendu. It has no sporting form, no belt ranking, no competition circuit, because none of those things are the point. It is built entirely around one governing idea, learned in the alleys and not in any dojo. Commit completely in the first seconds of a confrontation, even imperfectly, and you will beat almost any opponent who hesitates even slightly while deciding what to do. He names that opening burst the Mad Minute. The name is functional, not dramatic. It describes exactly how long the whole thing usually takes. Sykes joins the Shanghai Municipal Police and eventually runs the settlement's sniper unit, a discipline built on patience and precision that sits almost opposite to Fairbairn's close range, explosive work. The two men become partners anyway, approaching the same underlying problem, the gap between how violence is formally taught and how it actually happens, from two different directions. What they build together on firearms training changes doctrine on two continents for decades afterward. Standard police shooting technique in this era assumes time. Raise the weapon, extend the arm, align the sights, fire deliberately. At range, on a controlled course, that sequence is correct. At 3 feet, against a man already closing the distance with a knife, it takes longer than the situation allows, and there is no time to aim formally. Fairbairn and Sykes reduce close-range shooting to something that can be drilled without a range at all, and executed in total darkness. Point the weapon the way you would point a finger, fire, move immediately. They call it point shooting. They write the full system down in 1942 as shooting to live, and Allied instructors continue teaching from it for decades after the war has ended, because the underlying problem it solves, that combat distance and range distance are not the same thing. never goes away. Precision aiming asks for calm hands and a clear head, two things a real confrontation rarely grants. Point shooting asks only for the same instinct you already have when you point at something across a room, which is why it can be taught in an afternoon and still work at 2 in the morning, under fire, to someone who has fired a weapon 3 times in their life. By 1940, Fairbairn is 55 years old. Britain has been at war for less than a year. A new organization has just been created to fight a kind of war that has no real precedent, and somewhere in London, someone reads his personnel file and picks up a telephone. The organization on the other end of that call is the Special Operations Executive, and it has no template to work from. It does not hold territory. It does not fight along a front line in any conventional sense. It exists to put agents behind enemy lines, to support resistance networks, run sabotage operations, and gather intelligence inside countries under German occupation. Most of the people it recruits are not soldiers by training or temperament. They are civilians handed a false identity, a cover story, and a set of forged papers, and if they are caught, the Geneva Convention offers them nothing. They are shot, or worse. The training window the SOE can offer these recruits is not generous, because there simply is not time to make it generous. For unarmed combat specifically, the standard course is 6 lessons of 45 minutes each, 4.5 hours total, to prepare a person who may have been a school teacher or a bank clerk 6 months earlier to survive or to kill cleanly and silently in an occupied farmhouse at 2 in the morning months from now, with no instructor present and no second attempt if the first one fails. Fairbairn and Sykes are brought to Station 17 in Hertfordshire to solve that compression problem. Everything Fairbairn built across 33 years in Shanghai, the judo, the karate, the 600 fights, the years of testing technique against real consequence, has to be reduced to what a person with no combat background can retain after 4.5 hours and still execute correctly under conditions worse than anything a classroom in England can simulate. What survives that reduction is not a curriculum in any conventional sense. It is the same governing principle from the Shanghai alleys, stripped down to its bones and taught without apology. Attack the vulnerable points, commit completely, do not hesitate for even a second. Fairbairn calls what he teaches gutter fighting, and the name is not chosen for shock value. It is the plain, accurate description of what 600 nights of real violence actually taught him, with every polite convention of formal combat removed because those conventions get people killed. There is something worth sitting with here. A man spends 33 years surviving the most violent city on earth, one fight at a time, learning slowly and at real physical cost what actually works when nothing is fair. And then he is asked to compress every hour of that education into 4.5 hours for a stranger he will meet exactly once. That compression is not a training shortcut. It is the entire philosophy in miniature. Strip away everything that does not directly keep a person alive, and teach only what remains. That principle, ruthless economy applied to violence itself, governs every decision that follows, including the knife that comes out of this same brief. The recruits who pass through Station 17 are not soldiers by background. A school teacher who speaks fluent French, a radio engineer with family still living in Belgium, a woman who grew up spending summers in Lyon and can pass for a local without hesitation. What they share is language ability and nerve, not combat experience. And Fairbairn has to build people who have never thrown a serious punch in their lives into people who can end a confrontation in silence on the first attempt months from now, with nobody standing over their shoulder to correct a mistake. He does not soften the material for this audience. If anything, he simplifies it further, because a technique with 3 steps is a technique that gets forgotten under real pressure by someone who has practiced it 4 times. He also teaches something that has nothing to do with any specific technique. He teaches that hesitation is the actual enemy, not the opponent's skill, not the opponent's size, but the half-second an agent spends deciding whether to act. He has watched that hesitation kill men in Shanghai who were otherwise more than capable of winning the fight in front of them. He is not going to let it kill his students in France. The knife requirement comes directly out of the same operational brief. An SOE agent operating behind enemy lines needs a weapon that will not turn up in a routine search, something carried in a boot, or strapped flat under a sleeve, invisible under a civilian coat at a checkpoint. The primary mission profile it has to serve is specific and unforgiving. A sentry approached from behind in complete darkness, who has to be neutralized before he can make any sound at all. The operation fails the instant the sentry cries out. It fails if the technique takes too long. It fails if it demands more training than 4.5 hours can provide, or if it is not reliably lethal on the very first attempt. Because there will not be a second one. Fairbairn and Sykes sit down together and design a knife around exactly that job, and nothing else. Pick one up. The blade is double-edged, and that is not decoration, it is doctrine. A single-edged blade cuts only going in. A double-edged blade cuts coming back out too, and in the close fast work Fairbairn is designing for, a blade that drags or catches on the withdrawal costs precious seconds against a target who is still, however briefly, alive. The point is a needle. Thin, rigid, tapered down to almost nothing at the very tip. An SOE agent operating in occupied Europe in winter is working against men wearing heavy wool greatcoats and thick field kit. A wide, flat point loses momentum against that much layered material and can be turned aside by a rib or a thick seam. A needle point holds its force through the strike and passes straight through. The crossguard looks at first glance like a small and almost decorative detail. It is not. Under a full weight thrust, the kind Fairbairn's whole method is built around a bare hand naturally slides forward onto its own blade the instant the tip meets real resistance. This is not a theoretical concern invented after the fact. Fairbairn had felt exactly this failure himself, more than once in his early years in Shanghai, before his own technique had fully matured. The guard removes that risk completely. It lets an agent commit with the full weight of the body behind the strike, without the half-second flinch that instinctively pulls a hit short to protect the hand. The grip is modeled directly on a fencing foil handle, and it is built for a single motion and nothing else. A fast, fully committed thrust from close range. Not a slashing swing, not a defensive block, one motion repeated the same way every time. The balance of the entire knife assumes the same approach on every occasion it is used. From behind, one hand covering the target's mouth, the blade driven into the kidney, or the base of the skull, or the side of the throat, the exact points Fairbairn had already identified across 600 confrontations in Shanghai as the ones that end a confrontation immediately, and without any sound at all. If you have ever held a well-balanced knife, you already know the feeling this one is chasing. A tool that seems to move on its own once your hand closes around it. Every dimension of it, the taper, the guard, the grip, was chosen to produce exactly that sensation in someone who is trained for 4.5 hours, not 4.5 years. Then, in 1941, it becomes real steel. Wilkinson Sword produces the first run of the finished knife that year, and it moves into service almost immediately, first to the Commandos, then the Parachute Regiment, then the newly formed SAS. SOE agents carry it into occupied France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Strapped flat to a forearm under a civilian coat, crossing German checkpoints on forged papers, carrying 4.5 hours of training and a knife built entirely around a single specific task. The knife crosses the Atlantic with Fairbairn himself. He is sent to train the OSS, the wartime forerunner of the CIA, at Camp X on the north shore of Lake Ontario, the first purpose-built paramilitary training facility on North American soil, hidden from public knowledge for years after the war ended. He also trains at additional stations across the United States. Rex Applegate, who studies directly under Fairbairn during this period and later becomes the U.S. Army's chief hand-to-hand combat instructor, carries the entire doctrine forward into the American military at a scale Fairbairn himself never commanded directly. German forces capture examples of the knife in the field and manufacture their own copies. Soviet forces do the same independently once examples reach the Eastern Front. That is one honest, unsentimental way to measure whether a design actually works. Your enemies start making it too, without being asked. But copying a design is not the same as knowing how it was used. Much of the SOE's own internal paperwork was deliberately destroyed before the war ended, and more of it in the years immediately afterward. Operational security habits that outlived the operations they were protecting. What survives in the historical record is partial, but it is enough to establish a clear pattern of how this knife was actually used. Anders Lassen is a Danish officer serving with the British SAS, and he becomes the only non-Commonwealth soldier awarded the Victoria Cross in the European theater of the war. and the only recipient there to receive it posthumously. He commands small team night raids across the Mediterranean, the Greek islands, the Aegean, stretches of the Italian coast, hitting specific narrow objectives with minimal manpower and no room for a second attempt. His Victoria Cross citation describes him eliminating a line of armed enemy sentries in rapid sequence during a single raid, continuing to fight after being seriously wounded, and deliberately drawing enemy fire onto himself so the rest of his unit could withdraw safely. He is killed at Lake Comacchio in northern Italy in April 1945, weeks before the war in Europe ends. He is 24 years old. The knife travels through occupied France with SOE radio operators and couriers who understand what capture means for them, unprotected by any convention of war. It travels to Norway with the small teams behind the 1943 raid on the German heavy water facility at Vemork, one of the single most consequential sabotage operations of the entire war, credited with meaningfully setting back Germany's nuclear program. It is standard issue equipment for the men and women parachuted into occupied territory, carrying nothing but a cover identity built in a matter of weeks, and combat training built in 4.5 hours. Fairbairn personally trains thousands of soldiers and intelligence agents before the war concludes. He writes 4 manuals covering unarmed combat, point shooting, knife work, and close quarters battle as a combined discipline. Laying down much of the documented Foundation Special Forces training still draws on today. The British SAS carries his methods forward directly. The American tradition that grows out of the OSS and later informs Army and Marine close combat doctrine for decades carries them forward as well, frequently without Fairbairn's own name surviving anywhere in the institutional memory of where the techniques originated. Some of what he trains never sees combat in the way it was intended. Agents dropped into occupied territory frequently rely on the training's other half. The point shooting, the situational awareness, the instinct to move rather than freeze, far more often than they draw the knife itself. That is by design and not a failure of the weapon. Fairbairn never claimed the knife was the whole answer. It was the last option in a chain of options built for the moment every other tool had run out. That so many agents survived without needing it is itself evidence the rest of the system worked. But when the knife is needed, the record shows it does exactly the job it was built for. Field reports collected after the war describe sentries found at their posts with no sound having reached anyone nearby, no alarm raised, no indication anything had happened, until a relief guard arrived to find his replacement did not need relieving. That is, the entire design brief, executed in silence, in the dark, by people who 6 months earlier had never held a fighting knife in their lives. The knife has remained in continuous production for more than 80 years, and you can order one today built from the same basic pattern unchanged. The same double edge, the same needle point, the same cross guard, the same foil grip that Fairbairn and Sykes drew up together in a room in Hertfordshire in 1941, built entirely on top of 33 years of evidence that one man had personally collected on the streets of Shanghai. There is no film about him, no biography that crossed into general public memory. His name barely appears in most popular histories of the Second World War. Even in the ones that cover the SOE and the OSS and the Special Forces traditions his work directly made possible. Some of that obscurity is by design. If you were to hold one of these knives today in a museum case, a private collection, or a reenactor's kit, you would be holding the one piece of Fairbairn's life's work that never got absorbed into someone else's system, never got renamed, never lost its author entirely. The training system splintered into a dozen institutional lineages. The shooting doctrine got folded into manuals that rarely credit where it began. But the knife in your hand would be built to the same drawing Fairbairn and Sykes finalized in 1941. The same double edge, the same needle point, the same guard that lets a frightened hand commit without flinching. 600 fights recorded across 33 years. 4.5 hours to pass what he'd learned on to someone else. He didn't design a weapon from a drawing board or a theory. He spent 33 years paying close attention in the most violent city on Earth, and then he simply wrote down, with total precision, exactly what he had learned. Wilkinson's sword put an edge on it. If you enjoy my videos so far, please consider dropping a like and subscribe. It really means a lot to me.